Sometimes fate masquerades as a cheap opportunity, and the wisest men are those who recognize danger when it smiles back. Billy Hutchinson arrived in the small town of Dusty Creek on a Tuesday afternoon, as the sun turned the main street into a furnace of sand and lost hopes. 37 years on his back, boots worn out by the miles of road, and in his pocket only a few coins that jingled like empty promises. He had left behind a life that didn't work out in Colorado, and now he was looking for a fresh start where no one knew his name or his defeats. The city was nothing more than a handful of wooden buildings scattered along a single street, like loose teeth in an old man's mouth. The heat rose from the ground in invisible waves, making the landscape tremble like a mirage. Billy stopped in front of the post office, which also served as the area's notary office and business center. There, nailed to a faded board, he found what he was looking for: listings for properties for sale. His eyes scanned the offerings with the caution of one who had been deceived before. Land at prices that seemed like jokes, abandoned houses that promised more problems than solutions, but it was then that he saw something that made his heart race. A barn on the outskirts of town, selling for only 25 cents. The ad was simple, almost rude. Big barn, needs repairs, sells cheap. Billy knew barns. He had grown up on a farm in Kansas before drought and debt took it all away. He knew that even a damaged structure could be restored with time and effort. 25 cents was the price of a drink, and here was a chance to have a roof over your head and maybe even a small business. He entered the office, where a thin man with small glasses attended to him with the haste of someone who has many tasks and little patience. Billy pointed to the ad and said he was interested. The man studied him for a moment, as if trying to decipher some secret written on his face. "Are you sure about this barn?" asked the clerk, adjusting his glasses to his nose. "It's a property that it has its peculiarities." Billy just nodded and placed the coins on the counter. Money spoke louder than warnings, especially when there was so little of it. The man sighed, prepared the papers, and within minutes, Billy Hutchinson became the owner of a structure he had never seen. The directions were simple: 2 miles north, following the wagon road to a fork in the road marked by a dry tree. On the left, another kilometer, and there would be his new property. Billy thanked him, put the documents in the inside pocket of his vest, and went out into the dusty streets. Walking through the city, he noticed how people watched him with a mixture of curiosity and something more difficult to define. It wasn't hostility exactly, but there was a tension in the air, as if everyone knew something he didn't know. He stopped at a small hardware store to buy some basic necessities: hammer, nails, oil for lamp. The merchant, a man with a grey beard and grease-stained hands, was cordial but reserved. When Billy casually mentioned that he had bought the barn nearby, the man stopped what he was doing and stared at him directly. "That barn on the Morrison property?" he asked, his voice laden with something Billy couldn't identify. "I suppose so." The ad did not mention names. The merchant nodded slowly, as if he remembered times he would rather forget. He wrapped the tools in butcher paper and handed them to Billy without saying anything else. But his eyes spoke of untold stories, of secrets buried like seeds that should never germinate. Billy left town carrying his few possessions and a growing curiosity about what awaited him. The sun began to decline, painting the horizon with shades of orange and red that resembled dried blood on sand. The road stretched ahead like an uncertain promise, and with every step, Billy felt he was heading towards something bigger than a simple real estate purchase. The wind blew from the west, carrying the smell of sage and parched earth. It also brought something else, a scent that Billy couldn't fully identify, but that made him think of places closed for a long time, of secrets kept in the shadows of abandoned structures. When he finally caught sight of the fork in the fork marked by the dry tree, Billy paused for a moment to contemplate his choice. To the right, the road continued towards the unknown. To the left, a narrower path led to his destination. He chose the left, as he had chosen to leave Colorado, as he had chosen to bet 25 cents on an opportunity that seemed too good to be true. The barn loomed on the horizon like a scar in the landscape, its silhouette silhouetted against the rapidly darkening sky. Even from a distance, Billy could see that the structure was larger than he had imagined, and also more deteriorated. But still, there was something imposing about those wooden walls darkened by time, something that suggested stories of better days. He quickened his pace, eager to see his new property before darkness completely engulfed the valley. The wind increased in intensity, making the old barn wood groan and creak like tired bones. It was a sound that spoke of loneliness and abandonment, but also of possibilities. Billy Hutchinson did not yet know that he had bought much more than a simple barn. He had acquired a piece of the dark history of that place, a structure that held secrets like a vault holds gold, and like all buried treasures, some were best left in the dark. Night came faster than Billy expected, enveloping the estate in darkness that seemed denser than usual. The stars shone dimly in the sky, as if something on earth made them hesitate to show their full light. Billy lit his lamp and approached the barn, his footsteps echoing in the absolute silence of the valley. The structure was even more impressive up close, 3 stories high, with a base that could easily house 50 head of cattle. The wooden planks, darkened by years of exposure to the sun and storms, told the story of a solid building that had known prosperous days. But now rusty bolts hung from the hinges like dried tears, and some second-story windows were covered with boards nailed in from within. Billy circled the building, examining his new acquisition with the trained eyes of one who understood rural structures. The foundations seemed solid, despite a few loose stones here and there. The roof showed signs of leaks, but nothing that could not be fixed with time and adequate material. For 25 cents, it was being an excellent deal. It was when he reached the back of the barn that he found the first peculiarity. A small attached building, almost hidden by the shadow of the main structure, caught his eye. It appeared to be a storeroom, or perhaps quarters for workers, but its windows were not only covered, but sealed with mortar. Billy brought the lamp close to the walls, and saw that someone had taken the trouble to completely seal that space. He returned to the main entrance and examined the large double door that led to the interior. The chain that kept it closed was rusty, but not so much as to withstand a few well-applied blows. Billy chose a suitable stone and began working on the corroded metal, the sound echoing through the silent valley. When he finally managed to break the chain, the doors opened with a prolonged groan that seemed to awaken dormant echoes in the depths of the barn. The smell that came out of the opening made Billy instinctively retreat. It wasn't exactly unpleasant, but there was something about that still air that spoke of places closed for too long, of secrets kept in the darkness. He raised the lamp and took the first step into his property. The interior was vast, with solid wood beams extending in the shadows above his head. The floor was made of beaten earth, compacted by the years, and its footprints raised small clouds of dust that danced in the yellowish light of the lamp. At first glance, the barn seemed empty. A few bales of rotting hay piled up in a corner, and old farm tools hung from the walls like metal skeletons. But as Billy progressed, he realized that there were more internal structures than was common. Wooden partitions created separate compartments, as if the space had been adapted for specific purposes. It was in the third compartment that he found something that made him stop. On the ground, partially covered with old straw, was an area where the earth seemed to have been turned over recently. Not recently as in days or weeks, but certainly more recent than the construction of the barn. The ground was looser, as if someone had dug there and then tried to disguise the work. Billy bent down and ran his hand over the earth. There was definitely something buried there. His fingers touched something that was neither soil nor stone, something that looked like fabric or maybe leather. He withdrew his hand quickly, his heart racing for no apparent reason. He got up and continued exploring, trying to shake off the growing sense that he was not alone in this place. The lamp projected shadows that moved and danced across the walls, creating shapes that his mind insisted on interpreting as human figures. The silence was so deep that Billy could hear his own blood running through his veins. At the back of the barn, he discovered a wooden staircase that led to the second floor. The steps groaned under his weight but held firm. Upstairs, he found something that intrigued him even more. The compartments were arranged like bedrooms, small spaces divided by wooden screens, each with a small window that had been carefully sealed. In one of these rooms, Billy found traces of recent occupation. A blanket folded in a corner, a metal mug on a box that served as a table, a few candles consumed to the end. Someone had lived there, and it wasn't that long ago. The candles still had a faint scent of burnt wax. But it was in the last compartment that Billy found something that made him seriously question his purchase. Attached to the wall with nails were chains, not chains of farm work, but heavy handcuffs, the kind used to restrain people. The walls around it showed marks, deep scratches on the wood, as if someone had fought desperately against his embarrassments. Billy stepped back, his breathing getting harder in the stuffy air of the second floor. He began to understand why the barn had been sold for such a low price, why people in the town had reacted strangely when they heard of his purchase. This wasn't just an abandoned barn. It was a place where terrible things had happened. He descended the stairs faster than he had climbed, eager to get back outdoors, but even on the ground floor, the feeling of discomfort did not leave him. Now that she knew what to look for, she could see other disturbing signs. Dark spots on the floor that could be anything, but that his mind insisted on identifying as ancient blood. Scratches on the walls that spoke of despair and terror. Billy stepped out of the barn and took a deep breath of the night air, trying to clear his lungs of that atmosphere laden with dark secrets. He looked back at the structure, which now seemed more sinister than imposing. The sealed windows on the second floor watched him like blind eyes, holding testimonies of horrors that Billy was beginning to suspect. He set up a small camp at a safe distance from the barn, using some rocks to make a fire. As the flames crackled and drove away the darkness, Billy reflected on his situation. He had bought that property looking for a fresh start, but he seemed to have acquired the ghosts of someone else's past. The night wind made the old barn wood creak and groan, creating a melancholy symphony that spoke of loneliness and buried secrets. Billy knew he would have to make a decision. Run away from that place and lose his 25 cents, or stay and find out the whole truth about what he had bought. As he fed the fire with dry sticks, Billy Hutchinson was unaware that his decision was already made. Men like him, shaped by the adversities of the West, did not shy away from mysteries. They faced them, even when it meant digging up truths that others had tried to keep hidden forever. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky with soft shades of pink and gold that contrasted with the dark thoughts that had plagued Billy through the night. He had slept little, waking up with every noise coming from the barn, creaks of wood adjusting to the temperature, or maybe something else. In daylight, the structure seemed less threatening, but the secrets discovered the night before remained vivid in his memory. Billy decided he needed answers before making any decisions about his future there. He returned to Dusty Creek with a clear goal: to find out the history of the Morrison family and to understand why no one had mentioned that name directly. The city was waking up when he arrived, with some people opening their establishments and sweeping up the dust accumulated from the night before. He went directly to the local hall, a simple but clean establishment where men gathered to drink strong coffee and discuss the affairs of the region. The owner, a stout man in his 50s named Frank, greeted him with the reserved warmth typical of the place. Billy ordered coffee and waited for the right moment to ask his questions. "I heard about the Morrisons yesterday," Billy said casually, stirring the coffee with a small pewter spoon. "It looks like they owned the property I bought." Frank stopped cleaning the counter and looked at Billy with an expression that mixed surprise and concern. Other patrons of the salon were also silent, as if the Morrison name had the power to suck the joy out of any conversation. The Morrisons, Frank repeated slowly. I didn't expect to hear that name so soon again. He sighed and poured himself a cup of coffee before continuing. They were a respectable family. About 15 years ago, Thomas Morrison had that barn functioning as one of the best cattle operations in the area. Billy nodded, encouraging him to continue. Frank looked around, making sure the other customers were engaged in their own conversations before proceeding in a lower voice. Thomas had a wife, Martha, and 3 children. Honest workers, they contributed to the church, helped neighbors when needed. But then, the problems with the travelers began. Travelers? Billy asked, leaning forward slightly. People passing through the region looking for work or just a place to rest for a few nights. The Morrisons had always been hospitable, offering shelter in the barn in exchange for a few days of work. It seemed like a fair arrangement for everyone. Frank paused, as if gathering the courage to continue with the hardest part of the story. But some of these people have started to disappear. They arrived looking for work, and they were simply never seen again. At first, we thought they just continued their journey without warning. It happened frequently in those days. But then reports started coming in of families looking for relatives who had last been seen around the Morrison farm. Billy felt a chill down his spine, remembering the makeshift rooms and chains he had found on the second floor. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in a disturbing way. The sheriff at the time, a man named Coleman, decided to investigate, Frank continued. He went there with some deputies on an autumn afternoon. What they found... Frank shook his head, as if he still had trouble believing his own memory. They never spoke publicly about all the details, but it was bad. Too bad. What about the Morrison family? Thomas was dead when they got there. Apparently he had hanged himself in his own barn. Martha and the children had completely disappeared. They were never seen again. Some say they fled during the night. Others believe that something worse has happened to them. Billy processed this information, remembering the area of turned-up earth he had found in the barn. I was beginning to have a terrible idea about what might be buried there. The sheriff sealed the property, and it's been abandoned ever since, Frank concluded. Nobody in the region wanted to have anything to do with that place. That's why he was able to buy for so little. Billy finished his coffee quietly, thanked Frank for the information, and left the room with much more knowledge than he had arrived. The story explained the strange looks, the sealed windows, and especially the chains and compartments he had found. Thomas Morrison had turned his barn into a trap for solo travelers. Back on the property, Billy stared at the barn with fresh eyes. It was no longer just an abandoned structure, but the scene of terrible crimes that had shaken an entire community. She thought of Martha Morrison and her children, and wondered if they had been victims of their own husband and father, or if they had managed to escape before the situation became unbearable. He decided to do a more thorough investigation. He returned to the compartment where he had found the turned earth and began to dig carefully with a shovel he found among the abandoned tools. He didn't have to dig very deep before he found something that confirmed his worst fears. First it was a piece of tissue, then bones that clearly belonged to a human being. Billy stopped digging and retreated, breathing heavy. Here was the physical evidence of Thomas Morrison's crimes, buried like a dirty secret in the dirt floor. But there was something else that intrigued him. If Thomas Morrison had hanged himself when he was discovered, who had buried this evidence? Who had sealed the windows and locked the barn? Someone had tried to hide the crimes, or at least minimize their discovery. Billy spent the rest of the day exploring every inch of the property, looking for more evidence or clues about the fate of the Morrison family. In the small annex he had noticed the night before, he managed to force one of the boards that sealed a window. The interior revealed a space that had been used as a storage room, but also as a hiding place. He found a small wooden box hidden under some rusty tools. Inside, he discovered letters written by Martha Morrison herself. The first were cheerful, addressed to a sister who lived in the East, describing life on the farm and plans for the future. But as the dates progressed, the tone of the letters changed dramatically. Martha began to express concerns about her husband's strange behavior, about travelers who arrived but never left, about disturbing noises coming from the barn in the early hours. The last letter, dated just 2 weeks before the sheriff's investigation, was a desperate plea for help. "Thomas is no longer the man I married," Martha wrote in trembling handwriting. "I fear for my life and the safety of my children. If something happens to us, look in the barn. The truth is buried with his victims." Billy kept the letters carefully. Now he had not only physical evidence of the crimes, but also the testimony of the perpetrator's own wife. Martha Morrison had learned the truth about her husband and had tried to protect her children from this terrible discovery. As the sun began to set again, Billy made a decision that would change not only his future, but also bring some measure of justice to Thomas Morrison's forgotten victims. "I wouldn't run away from that place. Instead, it would cause the truth to come to light, no matter how disturbing it was." He lit a fire bigger than the night before, and prepared for another night in that place, haunted by secrets. But this time, he knew exactly what he needed to do. Thomas Morrison's victims had remained silent for 15 years. It was time for their voices to be heard again. The morning of the third day brought a clarity that Billy hadn't felt since he had arrived at this place. Sitting before the remains of the campfire, with Martha Morrison's letters neatly folded in his pocket and the weight of truth on his shoulders, he knew exactly what he needed to do. It wasn't just about justice for Thomas Morrison's forgotten victims, but about giving peace to the souls who had suffered in that place. Billy returned to Dusty Creek for the third time, but this time he carried with him the evidence that would forever change the community's perception of the events of 15 years ago. He went directly to the office of the current sheriff, a young man named William Hayes, who had taken office only 5 years earlier. Hayes listened in silence as Billy recounted his findings, showing Martha's letters and describing the remains he had found buried in the barn. The sheriff, initially skeptical, became progressively more serious as Billy presented each piece of evidence. "Coleman never talked about finding buried bodies," Hayes said, studying the letters carefully. "He always said the evidence was disturbing, but he never went into specific details." Billy understood that the former sheriff had tried to protect the community from a truth he considered too terrible to be fully revealed. But in doing so, it had denied the victims recognition of their sufferings and their families the possibility of proper closure. Hayes organized an official expedition to the barn that same afternoon. Together with Billy and 2 deputies, they carried out a careful excavation that revealed the remains of at least 6 different people. Each discovery confirmed Martha Morrison's harrowing testimony and painted an increasingly grim picture of her husband's crimes. As deputies documented the findings, Billy once again explored the makeshift rooms on the 2nd floor. It was there that he made his most significant discovery. Hidden behind a loose board, he found a diary that belonged to Thomas Morrison himself. The pages revealed the troubled mind of a man who had started out offering genuine hospitality, but who had progressively become obsessed with the power he wielded over vulnerable travelers. Morrison described his crimes with a coldness that made Billy feel nauseous, but he also provided details that would allow him to identify some of his victims. The final diary entry, dated the day before Sheriff Coleman's arrival, revealed that Morrison knew he would be discovered. Even more disturbing, it revealed the fate of Martha and the children. They had not fled, as many in the community had hoped. Morrison had taken their lives before taking his own, unable to face the shame of having his family discover the extent of his crimes. "I cannot allow you to see what I've become," Morrison had written in desperate handwriting. "It is better that they follow me in death than that they live with the mark of my name." Billy handed the diary to Sheriff Hayes, who read the final pages with a grim expression. The full truth about the Morrison family was even more tragic than anyone had imagined. Martha and the children were not accomplices, but Thomas Morrison's last victims. In the days that followed, the discovery of the evidence in the Morrison barn became the most discussed subject in Dusty Creek. Families who had searched for relatives who had disappeared years earlier finally got answers, albeit painful ones. Sheriff Hayes organized proper funerals for the identified victims, and the community came together to honor the memory of those who had been forgotten for so long. Billy faced a difficult decision about the future of the property. Some in the city suggested that the barn be completely destroyed, as if erasing the physical structure could also erase the memory of the crimes committed there. Others believed it should be preserved as a solemn reminder of the horrors that can lurk behind respectable facades. After much reflection, Billy chose a different path. Using his remaining savings and with the help of community volunteers, he turned the barn into a memorial. They removed the sinister partitions from the second floor and created an open, bright space where the families of the victims could come to pay their respects. The chains and other instruments of torture were buried, along with the remains of Thomas Morrison, in an unmarked grave at the back of the property. Frank, from the local hall, donated a large oil lamp that remained always lit in the center of the memorial, symbolizing that the victims would no longer be forgotten in the darkness. The walls were painted white, and windows were opened to allow natural light to purify the space that had known so much darkness. Billy decided to remain as custodian of the memorial, not out of obligation, but by choice. He had found a greater purpose than simply seeking a new beginning for his own life. Sometimes fate puts the right people in the right places, not to find what they're looking for, but to fulfill missions they didn't even know they needed to accomplish. During the quiet afternoons, Billy would sit at the memorial and read the letters that relatives of the victims sent from distant places. Words of gratitude for finally knowing what had happened to their loved ones, expressions of relief for knowing they were not forgotten, and promises that their memories would be honored. The wind was still blowing through the valley, but now it carried different aromas. Instead of the smell of secrets rotting in the darkness, it bore the scent of the wildflowers Billy had planted around the memorial. The creaking of old wood was replaced by the soft sound of wind chimes that hung from the rafters, creating a melancholy but peaceful melody. Billy Hutchinson had bought a barn for 25 cents, but he had won something much more valuable. He had found a way to transform a place of horror into a source of healing, a space where truth had finally prevailed over complicit silence. On clear nights, when the stars shone brightly over the memorial, Billy sometimes felt a peaceful presence around him. Not the tormented ghosts she had feared she would find, but the souls at peace of Martha Morrison and her children, grateful to finally have their stories told and their sufferings acknowledged. The rusty barn had kept its secrets for 15 years, but Billy Hutchinson had proved that some truths are too strong to remain buried forever. And sometimes, the best investment a man can make is not in his own prosperity, but in making sure that those who are already gone are not forgotten by those who remain. The memorial has become a symbol for the entire region, reminding everyone that the appearance of respectability can hide the most terrible truths, but also that there are always people willing to do what is right, even when it means facing the darkest secrets of the past. If this story of the Wild West has touched your heart and piqued your curiosity about the mysteries and secrets buried in the Badlands of the American West, you can't miss our next accounts. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to receive notifications of all our stories, where brave men and women face their destinies under the relentless desert sun. If you've been fascinated by the story of Billy Hutchinson and the mysterious barn that changed his life forever, get ready for more exciting adventures of the American Wild West. Our channel is dedicated to telling the most striking stories of men and women who faced their destinies in the barren and unforgiving lands of the West, where courage and determination were the only currency that was truly worth. Each narrative we share reveals the secrets buried in time, the difficult choices that define human character, and the mysteries that still echo through the valleys and mountains of that legendary era. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of these stories that capture the true essence of the American pioneer spirit.